The human brain is wired to assign value based on scarcity. This principle is at the core of why most avoidants begin to reconsider their decisions after a period of no contact. When something is always available, it is often taken for granted, but the moment it disappears, the mind perceives it as more valuable. This is a deeply ingrained psychological response that applies to relationships, opportunities, and even material possessions. It's not necessarily a conscious choice. It's a fundamental aspect of how the brain processes loss and desire. When an avoidant pulls away from a relationship, they do so because they feel overwhelmed by emotional closeness. Their need for independence and self-preservation overrides their desire for connection. At the time, creating distance feels like the right decision because it provides them with relief from the pressure they associate with intimacy. However, what many avoidants fail to anticipate is how their perception of that relationship will shift once they no longer have access to it. In the immediate aftermath of a breakup or period of no contact, an avoidant will often experience a sense of freedom. They might feel lighter, less burdened, and relieved from what they saw as emotional obligations. This stage can last for days, weeks, or even months. But then something changes. They start to notice the absence of the person they left behind. The messages that once felt overwhelming are now gone. The presence they once took for granted is no longer available. This is when their subconscious mind begins to reevaluate the situation. The moment they realize they no longer have guaranteed access to you, their brain begins to assign more value to what they lost. The same mind that once told them that the relationship was too much now starts to focus on what they're missing: the laughter, the deep conversations, the support, the connection. These things start to resurface in their memory, but in an idealized way. The brain doesn't hold on to negative emotions with the same intensity over time. Instead, it recalls the good moments, magnifying them and making them seem even more precious. This psychological shift happens because of something called loss aversion, a cognitive bias that causes people to fear losing something more than they value gaining something new. An avoidant may have felt suffocated in the relationship, but once they experience true absence, they realize that the comfort and connection they once had were more valuable than they initially thought. This is when regret starts to creep in. Regret is a powerful force. When an avoidant begins to experience it, they don't immediately act on it. Instead, they test the waters. They might check your social media, asking themselves if you've moved on. They might bring up your name in conversations with mutual friends. They might even scroll through old messages, reliving moments they had previously dismissed. During this time, they are assessing the situation, trying to determine if they still have an opportunity to reconnect. One of the biggest mistakes people make when dealing with an avoidant is assuming that their return means they have fundamentally changed. But what's really happening is that their perception of the relationship has shifted based on the fear of permanent loss. When someone disappears completely from their life, they are forced to reevaluate their decisions. However, this doesn't mean they have resolved the issues that caused them to leave in the first place. The push-pull dynamic is still present. It's just that in this moment, the pull is taken over. What's critical to understand is that the avoidance mind operates in cycles. When they feel closeness, they crave distance. When they feel distance, they crave closeness. This is why no contact often triggers them to return. The moment they sense that they no longer have access to you, the balance of power shifts. They are no longer in control of the situation, and this loss of control makes them question their decision. For someone on the receiving end of this dynamic, it's important to recognize what is happening from a psychological standpoint. The avoidant is not necessarily returning because they have experienced profound personal growth. They are coming back because the mind naturally amplifies the value of something once it is gone. This is why it's crucial to assess their actions, not just their words, when they do return. Are they showing genuine change, or are they simply responding to the psychological discomfort of loss? The key to navigating this situation is understanding that your absence is what triggered their change in perception. If you immediately re-engage without setting boundaries or expectations, the cycle will likely repeat. They will feel reassured that they still have access to you, and once that security is reestablished, their avoidance tendencies may return. However, if you maintain your self-respect and do not immediately give them the certainty they seek, they are forced to confront their own fears and patterns. Ultimately, the brain values what it loses because scarcity creates desire. When something is always available, it blends into the background. But when it is taken away, the mind fixates on it, assigning a greater meaning and importance. This is why avoidants often return after no contact, not because they have changed on a deep level, but because their perception of what they lost has shifted. Understanding this psychological principle allows you to navigate these situations with clarity and confidence, ensuring that you remain in control of your own emotional well-being. Most avoidants do not leave relationships because they don't care. In fact, many of them feel a deep connection to their partner, but they struggle to process emotions in a way that allows them to maintain that closeness. Their tendency to pull away is not about a lack of love, it is about their fear of vulnerability and emotional dependence. This fear stems from past experiences, often childhood dynamics, where closeness was associated with pain, suffocation, or a loss of personal identity. Because of this, their instinctive reaction to deep emotional bonds is to create distance. When an avoidant partner withdraws, it's easy to assume that they don't value the relationship. However, the reality is much more complex. Their minds are wired to protect themselves from what they perceive as emotional overwhelm. When the relationship reaches a point where emotional intimacy deepens, their subconscious alarm system activates, sending signals that they are losing control. Their response is to retreat, not because they want to lose the person they care about, but because they feel a strong need to regain their sense of safety. This pattern is why avoidants often need time and space to process their emotions. Unlike people with secure attachment styles who can navigate closeness and independence fluidly, avoidants struggle with the balance. They associate intimacy with pressure and obligation, which makes them feel trapped. However, once they have created distance, their fear of engulfment fades and a new reality sets in. They begin to feel the absence of the person they pushed away, and this triggers a completely different emotional response. During this period of separation, avoidants start to reflect on the relationship in a way that they couldn't when they were feeling overwhelmed. In the moment of withdrawal, they were focused on escape, on getting relief from the emotional intensity that made them uncomfortable. But once they have achieved that distance, they can see the relationship from a different perspective. Instead of feeling trapped, they begin to recognize the value of what they had. It's at this stage that they start to miss their partner, not because they suddenly changed overnight, but because their fear of closeness has temporarily subsided. They remember the connection, the emotional support, and the unique bond they shared. They begin to realize that the problem wasn't the relationship itself, but rather their own inability to sit with their emotions in the moment. However, the avoidant does not immediately act on these emotions. Instead, they often engage in a process of rationalizing and analyzing their feelings. Many avoidants struggle with emotional regulation, so they try to make sense of what they are experiencing through logic rather than emotion. They might replay conversations, look through old messages, or think about the best and worst moments of the relationship. They convince themselves that reaching out might not be necessary, but at the same time, they can't shake the feeling that something is missing. For many avoidants, the realization that they still care comes at a time when they least expect it. They might find themselves feeling nostalgic after hearing a song, seeing an old photo, or encountering a situation that reminds them of their former partner. This triggers a sense of longing, a desire to reconnect, even if they are unsure how to approach it. One of the biggest challenges for avoidants is admitting that they have emotional needs. Many of them have spent their lives believing that independence is the only way to protect themselves. They equate reliance on someone else with weakness, so acknowledging that they miss their partner creates internal conflict. This is why they often hesitate before reaching out. They don't want to feel vulnerable, and they fear that reconnecting might put them back in a position where they once again feel overwhelmed. When an avoidant finally does return, it's often because they have worked through their fears to the point where their need for connection outweighs their fear of intimacy. However, this does not mean they have fully changed. Avoidants who come back may still struggle with emotional closeness, and if the underlying issues that caused them to leave in the first place are not addressed, the cycle is likely to repeat. It's important to recognize that an avoidance return is not always a sign that they are ready for a healthy relationship. Their feelings for their partner may be genuine, but unless they have taken the time to understand their own attachment patterns, their natural instinct will be to retreat again once closeness is reestablished. This is why it's crucial to assess whether their return is accompanied by true growth or if it is simply a temporary response to missing what they lost. For those who have been on the receiving end of an avoidance push-pull cycle, it's important to remember that their withdrawal was not a reflection of a lack of love. It was a reflection of their struggle with vulnerability. Understanding this can provide clarity, but it also highlights the importance of setting boundaries. If an avoidant has not done the work to break their patterns, their return may only lead to another cycle of closeness and withdrawal. Ultimately, avoidants do care, but their ability to express that care is often hindered by their fear of emotional dependence. They leave not because they don't feel anything, but because they feel too much and don't know how to process it. When they return, it's because distance has allowed them to reconnect with those feelings in a way that feels safe to them. The question is not whether they care. The real question is whether they are ready to embrace that care in a way that allows for a truly healthy relationship. When an avoidant leaves a relationship, they often do so with a sense of certainty. In their mind, the choice to create distance feels like the right decision, a necessary step to regain their sense of independence and control. In the moment, they might feel relief, believing that the pressure of emotional closeness has been lifted. But what many avoidants fail to anticipate is the psychological shift that occurs when they experience true disconnection. In the early stages of no contact, they may not feel much. In fact, they might even enjoy the space. They tell themselves that they needed this, that being alone is better, that the emotional weight they were carrying has been lifted. They may throw themselves into work, hobbies, or other distractions, convincing themselves that they have moved on. But beneath the surface, something is changing. The human brain is wired for connection, even for those who struggle with emotional closeness. When an avoidant removes themselves from a relationship, their nervous system initially rewards them with a sense of relief. But as time goes on, that relief is replaced by a different kind of discomfort, one they didn't expect. The absence of their partner, once seen as freedom, begins to feel like a void. This is where cognitive dissonance begins to take hold. Cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort that arises when a person holds two conflicting beliefs or feelings at the same time. For avoidants, this dissonance emerges when they start to realize that the relationship may have meant more to them than they initially admitted. They told themselves that leaving was the best decision, but now they are starting to feel the weight of loss. This creates an internal conflict. If they truly didn't care, why do they keep thinking about their partner? If they were so sure about leaving, why do they feel unsettled now? At first, they may try to suppress these thoughts. Avoidants are skilled at compartmentalization, pushing emotions aside in order to maintain a sense of control, but emotional suppression is not the same as emotional resolution. No matter how much they try to distract themselves, certain triggers will begin to break through their defenses. A familiar scent, a song, a place they once visited together, these small reminders activate dormant emotions. Over time, their mind starts to rewrite the past. This is a natural psychological process. When people experience loss, they tend to idealize what they had. The negative emotions that once felt overwhelming begin to fade, while the positive aspects of the relationship become more prominent. The arguments that once seemed unbearable now seem trivial. The flaws they fixated on no longer feel as significant. What once felt suffocating now feels comforting in retrospect. This is when an avoidant starts questioning their own narrative. In the beginning, they were convinced that leaving was the right choice, but now they are not so sure. The same brain that once prioritized independence is now craving connection. This internal conflict creates a sense of unease. They don't like feeling out of control, and yet they are no longer in control of how they feel. This is the turning point when they begin to consider reconnecting. However, avoidants do not typically return with immediate grand gestures. Instead, they test the waters subtly. They may start by checking your social media, looking for signs that you still care. They may reach out in seemingly casual ways, sending a message that appears friendly but is actually an attempt to gauge your response. They might ask mutual friends about you or find indirect ways to stay in your orbit. This behavior is driven by a need to resolve their cognitive dissonance, to see if you are still available, if the door is still open. At this stage, their desire to reconnect is not necessarily about a profound realization or personal growth. It is about soothing their internal conflict. They want reassurance that they haven't truly lost you, that they still have access to the connection they once took for granted. If they sense that you have moved on, it can intensify their feelings of loss, making them even more likely to pursue reconciliation. Understanding this process is crucial because it reveals that an avoidance return is often rooted in their own emotional struggle rather than a deep transformation. They are not necessarily coming back because they have worked through their fear of intimacy, but because they are uncomfortable with the dissonance of losing something that once provided them with emotional security. For those on the receiving end, it's important to recognize that just because an avoidant returns does not mean the underlying patterns have changed. Their emotional conflict might push them to reconnect, but without true self-awareness and inner work, the same cycle of avoidance and withdrawal is likely to repeat. This is why setting boundaries and observing their actions, rather than just listening to their words, is key to determining whether their return is truly meaningful or simply a temporary response to emotional discomfort. Avoidants experience cognitive dissonance when they realize that the relief they sought by leaving was only temporary. The loss of a meaningful connection forces them to confront emotions they tried to escape. This realization often compels them to return, not necessarily because they are ready for deep emotional commitment, but because their mind is seeking resolution. Understanding this dynamic can empower you to navigate the return with clarity, ensuring that you make decisions that align with your own emotional well-being. Avoidants often have an inner conflict when it comes to relationships. On one hand, they crave love, intimacy, and connection just like anyone else. On the other hand, they fear that emotional closeness will lead to discomfort, overwhelm, or a loss of independence. This push-pull dynamic is what leads them to create distance when things start feeling too intense. But something interesting happens after a period of no contact. They begin to feel safe again. For an avoidant, the act of pulling away from a relationship is not always about not wanting their partner. It is about needing space to regulate their emotions. When they are in close proximity to someone they care about, their subconscious fears and anxieties get triggered. The more their partner tries to get closer, the more their defense mechanisms activate. They may feel smothered, controlled, or pressured to meet emotional expectations they don't believe they can handle. Their solution: withdraw, create space, and regain their sense of autonomy. However, when they get that space, especially in the form of no contact, something shifts. The pressure that once made them feel overwhelmed starts to fade. They are no longer receiving texts that they feel obligated to respond to. They are no longer feeling watched or expected to show up emotionally. They begin to feel like they are in control again. And this feeling of control is what makes them feel safe. Safety is a powerful factor in human relationships, and for avoidance, feeling safe means feeling like they can exist without emotional demands being placed upon them. In a strange way, no contact gives them exactly what they wanted: time, space, and freedom from pressure. But ironically, it also creates the conditions for them to reconsider their feelings, because once the sense of being overwhelmed disappears, the positive aspects of the relationship start to come into focus. Now that they are no longer in a state of emotional stress, they can reflect on the connection they had without feeling burdened by it. They start remembering the good times, the laughter, the intimacy, the companionship. They begin to miss the person they once felt they needed distance from. The same mind that once convinced them to leave now starts convincing them that they made a mistake. This is why no contact is often so effective in triggering an avoidant to return. It gives them the space they think they need, but it also removes the emotional triggers that made them feel unsafe. And once those triggers are gone, they can think clearly about what they actually lost. Another important factor in this process is the avoidant's need to feel like they are making decisions on their own terms. When someone chases them or tries to convince them to stay, they feel pressured and resistant. They double down on their need for independence and push away even harder. But when their former partner goes silent, when they stop chasing and seem to move on, suddenly the avoidant is left alone with their thoughts. There is no longer an external force pushing them in one direction or the other. The choice to reconnect, if they make it, feels like it is coming from them rather than from outside pressure. This is crucial because avoidants don't like feeling forced into anything. They value autonomy above all else. If they believe they are being pulled back into a relationship out of obligation, they will resist. But if they come back on their own, it feels safer. They feel like they are the ones in control of the decision, and this makes them more open to reconnecting. Of course, just because an avoidant returns does not mean they have overcome their deeper fears of intimacy. Their return is often a result of feeling safe again, but that doesn't mean the same fears won't resurface once emotional closeness is reestablished. If their partner immediately welcomes them back without setting boundaries or clarifying expectations, the same cycle of avoidance may repeat. This is why understanding this process is so important. When an avoidant feels safe, they can access their true feelings, but if the underlying issues that cause them to leave are not addressed, their avoidant tendencies will eventually return. They may come back feeling nostalgic and affectionate, but unless they have done the inner work to heal their attachment patterns, the same fears that made them leave in the first place will still be present beneath the surface. For those who are dealing with an avoidant partner, this means that their return should not be taken as an automatic sign of lasting change. Instead, it should be viewed as an opportunity to observe whether they are willing to work through their fears in a meaningful way. Are they communicating differently? Are they showing a deeper awareness of their patterns? Or are they simply returning because they feel safe again, only to leave once the emotional intensity builds up? Avoidants need space to process their emotions, and no contact gives them that space. But what happens after that space is what truly matters. If they come back, it's often because they feel safe again, not because they have fully transformed. Recognizing this can help those dealing with an avoidant partner navigate the situation with clarity, ensuring that their own emotional well-being remains a priority. Avoidants often struggle with emotional closeness, not because they don't desire connection, but because they have a deep-rooted fear of dependency and vulnerability. When they leave a relationship, they usually convince themselves that they are better off alone, that the emotional intensity was too much to handle, or that they need space to feel like themselves again. But after a period of no contact, a shift happens. The space that once felt like freedom starts to feel empty. The independence they craved no longer provides the relief they expected. Instead, it creates a new discomfort, one that forces them to recognize the emotional impact of their decision. At first, an avoidant may feel a sense of relief when they leave. They might tell themselves that the relationship was too demanding or that they were losing their personal autonomy. In their mind, the act of leaving represents a return to emotional safety. But what they don't anticipate is how their emotions will evolve over time. Unlike securely attached individuals who can process emotions in real time, avoidants suppress their feelings until they become unavoidable. This means that their realization of loss often comes much later, after they have had enough space to let their defenses lower. Once they reach this stage, they start experiencing an emotional void they didn't expect. The absence of their partner is no longer just a relief, it starts to feel like something is missing. They may begin replaying past memories, remembering the small moments of affection, companionship, and emotional support that they once took for granted. What seemed overwhelming before now feels like comfort. What they distanced themselves from now feels like something they need. This is when an internal struggle begins. Avoidants have spent much of their lives believing that they don't need others, that emotional independence is their strength, and that vulnerability is dangerous. But now they are confronted with a feeling they can't easily ignore. Their mind begins to rationalize their emotions in an attempt to make sense of them. They might tell themselves that they don't actually miss their partner, that they just miss the routine or the familiarity. They might convince themselves that reaching out would be a mistake because they need to remain in control. But emotions don't follow logic. The more they try to suppress their feelings, the more they surface. The emotional void that was once manageable becomes harder to ignore. They start noticing that their usual distractions, work, hobbies, socializing, aren't as fulfilling as they used to be. They might catch themselves comparing new experiences to what they once shared with their partner, realizing that nothing quite measures up. This is the moment when an avoidant begins to consider returning, not because they have completely transformed, but because their emotional defenses have weakened just enough to allow them to recognize their feelings. Their fear of intimacy may still be present, but it is momentarily overshadowed by the realization that being without their partner doesn't feel as good as they expected. However, avoidants don't typically act on their emotions immediately. They hesitate, weighing the risks of reconnecting. They fear that if they come back, they will once again feel overwhelmed. They worry that they will lose the sense of control they work so hard to regain. This is why they often take a passive approach, checking social media, asking mutual friends about their ex, or sending a casual message that feels non-committal. They want to test the waters to see if their partner is still emotionally available before fully committing to returning. One of the most complicated aspects of this process is that the avoidant's desire to return does not necessarily mean they have resolved their deeper issues with intimacy. Their return is often driven by a temporary emotional shift rather than a permanent change in their attachment style. If the relationship resumes without addressing the underlying fears that caused them to leave in the first place, the cycle of avoidance is likely to repeat. For those on the receiving end, understanding this pattern is crucial. Just because an avoidant comes back does not mean they are ready to fully engage in a healthy, emotionally open relationship. Their return may be more about soothing their own discomfort than about true personal growth. This is why it is important to observe their actions rather than just their words. Are they showing a greater willingness to communicate? Are they demonstrating emotional accountability? Or are they simply returning because they feel the void of your absence and want temporary relief? An avoidance realization of loss is often a delayed process. Their initial instinct is to suppress emotions and maintain control, but over time, the emotional void becomes undeniable. This leads them to reconsider the connection they walked away from, not because they have overcome their fears, but because the absence of their partner forces them to confront feelings they can no longer ignore. Understanding this can help those dealing with an avoidant partner navigate the situation with clarity, ensuring that they do not fall into the same cycle without meaningful change. Avoidants often struggle with emotional commitment not because they don't want love, but because they fear what it represents: vulnerability, dependency, and the risk of losing themselves in another person. When they walk away from a relationship, they do so under the belief that they are regaining control over their lives. They convince themselves that separation is necessary for their well-being, that being alone is preferable to the emotional demands of a partnership. But what they don't anticipate is how time and distance will reshape their perspective. In the early days of no contact, they feel justified in their decision. Their mind reinforces the narrative that they needed to leave, that the relationship was too intense, too demanding, or simply not right for them. They immerse themselves in distractions, work, hobbies, social events, anything that allows them to maintain the illusion that they have moved on. But despite their best efforts, something begins to shift. The further they get from the relationship, the more they begin to see it differently. Time has a way of altering perception. The moments that once felt suffocating now seem comforting. The flaws they once fixated on no longer feel as significant. The arguments that felt unbearable now seem minor in comparison to the loss they feel. This process is not unique to avoidance. It is a common psychological pattern known as emotional reframing. When people experience loss, their brain naturally begins to highlight the positives of what they once had, making them question whether leaving was the right choice. For For avoidance, this shift is particularly powerful because it forces them to confront emotions they tried to suppress. Unlike securely attached individuals who process emotions in real time, avoidants push their feelings aside, convincing themselves that they don't need to address them. But emotional suppression does not equal emotional resolution. The feelings don't disappear, they simply resurface later, often when the avoidant least expects them. As time passes, the absence of their partner becomes more noticeable. They realize that no matter how much they distract themselves, there is a void that hasn't been filled. The emotional connection they once shared starts to feel like something they need rather than something they needed to escape from. This realization is uncomfortable for them because it contradicts their deeply held belief that they are better off alone. This is when avoidants start to rationalize their emotions. They don't like the idea of admitting they made a mistake, so they find ways to justify their desire to return. They might tell themselves that their ex was actually the best person for them, that they were just not ready at the time, or that the breakup was a misunderstanding that can now be fixed. They start idealizing the past, rewriting the narrative to make it easier to reconnect without confronting their deeper fears. Once they reach this stage, their next step is often testing the waters. They may not immediately express their feelings or admit that they miss their partner. Instead, they take a more indirect approach, liking social media posts, casually reaching out with a nonchalant message, or finding excuses to reconnect. They want to gauge whether their partner is still emotionally available without fully committing to a conversation about what went wrong. Their return is often strategic. Avoidants are not impulsive in their emotional decisions. They weigh their actions carefully, ensuring they don't put themselves in a vulnerable position. They want to know that they will be received positively before they make a move. If they sense that their ex has moved on or is no longer receptive, they may retreat again, convincing themselves that they were right to leave in the first place. However, just because an avoidant returns does not mean they have fundamentally changed. Their need for connection has temporarily outweighed their fear of intimacy, but unless they have done the inner work to address their attachment patterns, the cycle is likely to repeat. They may come back, but as soon as the relationship begins to feel too close or too emotionally demanding, their old fears can resurface, leading them to withdraw again. For those on the receiving end, recognizing this pattern is essential. The fact that an avoidant comes back does not necessarily mean they are ready for a deeper commitment. It often means they are seeking relief from their own discomfort. They want to reconnect because they miss the emotional security of the relationship, but if they haven't addressed their avoidance tendencies, they may struggle to maintain that connection in the long run. Understanding this can empower those who have been in relationships with avoidance to make more informed decisions. Instead of interpreting their return as a sign of change, it is important to observe their behavior. Are they communicating openly? Are they demonstrating emotional accountability? Are they willing to discuss what led to the breakup and take steps to prevent it from happening again? If the answer is no, then their return may be more about soothing their own discomfort than building a healthier relationship. Avoidants come back not because they have conquered their fear of intimacy, but because time and distance have allowed them to reframe the past. The emotional distance that once felt necessary begins to feel like loss, and that loss compels them to reconnect, but without real self-awareness and growth, their return is often temporary, driven by nostalgia rather than a true readiness for change. Recognizing this pattern can help those involved with avoidance set boundaries, ensuring that they do not fall into the same cycle without meaningful progress. And so what we begin to understand is that avoidants don't come back simply because they've changed overnight. They return because distance has given them a new perspective, because the emotional intensity that once overwhelmed them has faded, and because the loss they once dismissed now feels undeniable. But recognizing why they return is only half the battle. The real question is whether they are ready to break the cycle. For those who have experienced this dynamic, the key is to approach their return with awareness, not just hope. Look beyond their words and examine their actions. Are they showing emotional accountability? Are they willing to communicate differently? Are they taking real steps to heal the patterns that pushed them away in the first place? Because if they're not, their return may be just another phase in an ongoing cycle rather than the transformation you deserve. You have to remember that your emotional well-being matters just as much as theirs. It's not just about whether they are ready, it's about whether this relationship can truly give you the love, security, and connection you need. Because a healthy relationship isn't about waiting for someone to overcome their fears, it's about two people showing up fully and consistently for one another. So whether they come back or not, the most important thing is that you stay true to yourself, that you recognize your own worth, set your own boundaries, and make choices from a place of strength, not scarcity. Because at the end of the day, the most powerful thing you can do isn't waiting for someone else to change. It's stepping into the kind of relationship where you don't have to question whether you're valued, cherished, and prioritized. Thank you all for being here today, for showing up, for being open to growth, and for choosing to create a life and love that truly honors you. Keep learning, keep growing, and most of all, never settle for less than you deserve. Thank you. Why most avoidants come back after no contact. Have you ever had someone pull away, disappear, and then out of nowhere they come back, and you're left wondering, why now? Why after all this time? I'll tell you why, because human behavior is predictable. Most avoidants run, but they also return. And if you understand why, you take back your power. No more confusion, no more waiting, just clarity, confidence, and control. Let's break it down. An avoidant personality type operates from a deep-rooted fear of emotional closeness. The closer they get to someone, the more vulnerable they feel, and vulnerability is something they have spent their entire lives avoiding. This fear doesn't necessarily come from a lack of love or interest. In fact, many avoidants deeply care about their partners. The issue is that intimacy represents a threat to their sense of control, their personal space, and their autonomy. As a result, when the relationship reaches a certain level of closeness, their natural instinct is to pull away. This push-pull cycle is a pattern they have likely been repeating for years, maybe even their entire lives. It starts with attraction, excitement, and even deep emotional connection. But the moment the connection becomes too deep, the avoidant starts feeling trapped. They begin to notice things they didn't before, small flaws, imperfections, or differences that suddenly feel overwhelming. They convince themselves that the relationship is too much, that they need space, or that something about the situation just doesn't feel right. It's not that they have lost interest, it's that their defense mechanisms have kicked in, telling them that closeness equals danger. So they create distance. Some avoidants pull away slowly, responding less and becoming emotionally unavailable. Others leave abruptly, cutting ties in a way that leaves their partner confused and hurt. Regardless of how they leave, the message they send is the same. This is too much for me. But here's where things get interesting. Once they are gone and have created the distance they believe they need, something shifts. That overwhelming sense of pressure they once felt starts to fade, and with it, the urgency to escape. The space they desperately crave starts to feel empty. Without the constant presence of their partner, they are left with their own thoughts and feelings. At first, this feels like relief. They might enjoy the solitude, the freedom, the ability to move without emotional responsibility. But in time, their mind starts to wander back to the relationship. They recall the good moments, the laughter, the connection. The negative feelings that drove them away begin to blur, and suddenly they start missing what they once had. At this point, they start to wonder if they made a mistake. Since most avoidants struggle with deep self-reflection, they don't always recognize their own emotional patterns. Instead of seeing their fear of intimacy as the root cause of their withdrawal, they begin to reframe the relationship in a different light. Maybe I was too harsh, they think. Maybe I left too soon. This is where the pull begins. The same person they once ran from now seems like the very thing they want. The reason this happens is because avoidance isn't about a lack of love, it's about a lack of emotional security. When an avoidant leaves, they feel temporarily safe from the perceived pressure of closeness. But once they have had time to breathe, they begin to crave connection again. They start to feel lonely, not necessarily because they are alone, but because deep down, they do want love and connection, they just fear it. What's important to understand is that this cycle will repeat itself unless the avoidant does the inner work to break it. Without self-awareness, they will continue to push away what they desire most, only to seek it again when the fear subsides. This is why many avoidants come back after no contact, not because they have changed, but because their fear of intimacy has temporarily taken a back seat to their need for connection. If you've ever been in a relationship with an avoidant, you might recognize this cycle. The initial closeness, the slow withdrawal, the eventual distance, and then, just when you've started to move on, they reappear. They might reach out casually, testing the waters. They might apologize, telling you they miss you. They might even promise that things will be different this time. But unless they have truly confronted their avoidance patterns, the cycle is likely to repeat. Understanding this dynamic is key to reclaiming your power. The problem is not that you weren't enough or that you did something wrong. The issue is that avoidants struggle with balancing their desire for connection with their fear of losing themselves in a relationship. Until they face that fear head on, they will continue to push and pull. This is why going no contact is often the best strategy, not to get them back, but to break the cycle and shift the power back to yourself.